Greetings, YouTube. Goblin Nerd has asked me to do a little research and to look into the FantasyCraft weapons rules. Now, this is the first edition of the game. I've heard there's a second. I haven't read it. And he asked me to look at it from the position of someone that enjoys weapons in the real world, has done a lot of research in that particular field. I'm not an expert, but I am what you would consider a very well-informed layperson. And I happen to have a love of equipment. Books for role-playing games. I own equipment and tech books for games that I don't even own the system of, just because I think that they're cool. So he asked me to take a look at some of these things, because a couple of the things that he has discovered in this don't make any sense to him. So he's kind of looking for someone to give him a hand and get a grip on, do I agree that these things do or do not make sense. So I gave the charts themselves a once over, and there's a couple of discrepancies I find in the reasoning of on the charts, and then a couple of the descriptions, to my mind, don't really mesh with what I know about weapons out here in like the real world. So, for example, the mallet is a one-handed hammer, perfectly acceptable description of a mallet, and it does a die 6 of lethal damage, perfectly acceptable. Then we have a maul. Now, a maul is a large two-handed hammer, an analog in the real world that most people would be familiar with would be a sledgehammer. A sledgehammer is a maul. The ones in period would have fairly likely been made out of wood, banded with metal perhaps, but they do the same job. They are a big weight on the end of a big stick, and it delivers a whole lot of energy in a very slow manner to a target. Most often, a rock or a spike or something like that. You're trying to drive something into something else, but they could be used as a weapon, and I think the best example I can think of would be Conan the Barbarian, one of the brothers that he faces, who swings a maul, hits a pillar, a stone column, and breaks it. Is hilarious, and a great example of what a maul can look like. And mysteriously, that weapon here, which does 2 die 6, which makes perfect sense, is described as subdual damage. Yet a one-handed hammer that does 1 die 6 is lethal, and the two-handed version, which does 2 die 6, is subdual. That is an interesting design choice, not one that I would have made. Now, having blunt weapons having the option of subdual, if you wanted to, as in most weapons do, would make sense. And there are some blunt weapons that having them do just subdual damage makes a lot of sense. For example, your standard club, 2-foot hunk of wood. Yeah, I can buy that. It's a baton. Completely. Just doing subdual damage, no argument. But a two-handed maul, that is a strange decision in my opinion, and I am curious how they arrived at that particular choice. I don't think there's anything else on the blunt weapon chart that kind of makes no sense. Let me think in here. And for example, this does make sense, which is the great club does lethal damage, while the normal club does subdual. And yet, in the hammers, the smaller version does lethal damage, and the larger version doesn't subdual, which is kind of mystifying. Then we get into the edged weapons. Let me see, anything in the edged weapons as far as... the rapier does stress damage, because I think that the rapier, the game is kind of presenting it as something that does little tink, 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 tinks on someone, like little pinpricks, little tiny slashes. A rapier can run you through. And I'm not using that turn of phrase as an act of hyperbole. That is not some euphemism for something else. No. A rapier can literally run through your body because you are concentrating a great deal of energy on one very small, sharp point. Now, if you were going to say that rapier will only do damage against someone who's wearing certain types of armor, that would make sense. A rapier could go through some clothing, standard leather, maybe studded leather. It would probably go through chainmail without any difficulty. Padded classic cloth armor, that's not going to stop a rapier. But any kind of hard metal, or maybe even Kerboli, high quality leather armor, which in many regards functions as plastic, those things could completely defeat or greatly reduce a rapier's ability to harm the wearer. But if you're not wearing heavy armor like that, you can kill someone with a rapier. Not just stress them until you've worried them to death. Yes, I realize the game is using stress in a different manner. The point I'm trying to make is, to my mind, that was, again, an interesting design choice. As far as the other things on the chart, I don't have any problems with how the rest of them. There was something in here that didn't make any sense to me. Okay, the falchion / nodachi. Now, a nodachi is a very large style two-handed sword. It's a two-handed version of a katana. So you've seen it in video games. The falchion, however, was a one-handed European sword with a broad blade. It is not the Hassan chop stereotypical sword used by Arabian eunuchs. A falchion was a European one-handed sword with a kind of a sweeping blade. It was broad, but it was in many ways kind of a upgraded version of a machete. And if you want to look at it that way, you could. An upgraded, larger version of a one-handed machete, that would be a falchion. But the traditional ones were not two-handed. So again, interesting design choice. You got the glaive naginata pretty much nailed. They describe the katana as the steel of this masterful sword is folded over itself to create hundreds of layers that let it hold a superior edge while remaining flexible enough to not shatter in combat. Truism, hundreds of layers were created in the process, but if you looked at some of the European swords, they had hundreds of layers too. Some of them, the steel was just as good as the stuff being produced in Japan. That they were so much better than the Europeans is kind of a myth, and it seems that the game designers here have kind of fallen into that trap. Even I fell into that trap when I was younger. It happens to the best of us. Longsword. Here we go. Longsword is listed as a one-handed sword. Okay. One of the problems with the term longsword is it didn't exist. There is no such thing as a longsword historically. If you ask a dozen weapons experts and what a longsword is, you will get 13 answers. But if you just call it a one-handed sword, and it's described as a one-handed sword, that clears up some things a bit. So if you think of it as a one-handed sword, the following description, to my mind, is a bit mystifying. With a 3 to 4 foot double-edged blade and low weight, the longsword is popular with adventurers everywhere. Okay, if you have a 3-foot sword, that's what would be described as a hand-and-a-half sword, or in your classic fantasy definition would be a bastard sword. Potentially usable with one hand if you have exotic training. If you don't, it's a two-handed weapon. But if your sword has a 4-foot blade, that's 48 inches long, that's a two-handed weapon. And while it isn't as heavy as it is presented in most games, it isn't as light as your traditional one-handed sword, which is going to have a blade in the 24 to 30 inch range. 36 inches, you got to think, oh, 30 to 36, that's not much. No, that's a lot. And the additional weight and the additional mass you're moving is significant. So yes, one-handed exotic, two-handed without an exotic skill, and a 3-foot sword. If it's a 4-foot sword, it's a two-handed weapon. Also, I don't know, does this game use weights as the definition of actual weight? Like when it's telling me that, you know, a bow weighs X amount of pound, X weight here. Now, they're describing weight as if I put it on a scale, that's what the scale is going to read? Or is it some kind of vague encumbrance? I don't know. Someone tell me if FantasyCraft is representing it as encumbrance, or is it representing it as pure how we measure mass on Earth? Because if it's that one, some of the weights, most of the weights in this book are way off. But that's true of D&D and fantasy-type games forever. So, not a shock there. Anything else on those edged weapons that I thought was a little weird? Ninjato is in here. It's also being described as a sword cane. The Ninjato, as we know it, the class of ninja sword, is pretty much fictitious. It pretty much didn't exist in period. It exists in the modern world, but that doesn't mean it existed in period. That it exists in a fantasy game is fine. That's not an issue. But they didn't probably exist at all in period. Pole sword Nagamaki. They got that pretty well nailed. I love the Nagamaki. I think that's an awesome weapon. They've got the sickle, as being under the same description category, which also makes perfect sense. So kudos to the game designers. They are the same agricultural tool and could be used in the same way in combat if you were so trained. Oh yes, they do, however, have the scythe here. I own a scythe, for real. It's in my garage. And I'm telling you, a scythe is not a melee weapon. The only way you could use a scythe as a melee weapon is if you were standing alone and had no one near you for 10 feet in any direction except the person you want to hurt. So if you tried to use that in combat with a companion on either side of you in the classic D&D spacing of 5 feet, you're going to be more of a danger to your compatriots than you are to the enemy in front of you. So, yeah, scythes at best are improvised weapons. They are not actual melee weapons. They should never be categorized as melee weapons. Ever. Okay, hurled weapons. Don't think I saw anything here that was really egregiously off base. For example, shurikens being listed as stress damage. I can buy that. They're an annoyance, possibly designed best to deliver poisons. But mostly as a distraction, so listing them as stress makes perfect sense. Boomerangs do subdual damage. Oh yes, the boomerangs described in this are the ones that return. Boomerangs that return are toys. Actual ones used for hunting and combat were large, asymmetrical, and did not return. They were pretty heavy as far as an object being thrown is, could weigh as much as 2 to 3 pounds. And they could have aerodynamic characteristics. For example, some of the hunting ones were designed to skim along the ground and then they would swoop upwards. The idea being it would move forward, it would spook a flock of birds, who would then go flap, 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 and then it would go through said flock of birds, hitting one or more birds and breaking their wings and things like that. But they did not return. Returning boomerangs are toys. Now, if you want to have an exotic weapon like, is it the Githka for the Thrycreans that comes back to the user, cool, do that. But real world boomerangs did not return to people. The bow descriptions here. Anything on the bows? Again, if the weights in here are describing actual, you put it on a scale and that's how much you read off the dial as pounds, makes absolutely no sense. They've got a hand crossbow in here weighing 5 pounds. That's baffling. Now, if it's just encumbrance, to my mind, that's still baffling. A hand crossbow is not large, and I don't think it should have 5 pounds of encumbrance, and it definitely shouldn't have 5 pounds of weight. They do have down here pellet bows as doing some dual damage. No argument there whatsoever. Now here's something interesting. If you look at the weights of the black powder weapons, they're almost spot on. I mean, I am sure you could actually find real world war versions of these weapons that actually weigh what are listed in the game. And why is that? Because we, the people of the 20th and 21st century, are familiar with hand weapons. I mean, rather with firearms. We've held them in our hand, that's what I meant to say. People can go pick up a pistol. They can pick up a rifle. Yes, reproductions, obviously, more or less you're really lucky and have access to period flintlocks and matchlocks, which I don't. I have held a flintlock rifle from the American Revolution. That was awesome. But they're present. You can go to the store and buy a reproduction, which is darn close to the originals. And so we are familiar with what firearms weigh like, what they feel like in the hand. So those weapons in here are listed, and their weights are fairly accurate to what they would have been in period and what they are in the real world. Whereas most of the weapons that I'm having a problem with the weights / encumbrance here are weapons that most people will never ever hold. And that degree of unfamiliarity is, to my mind, why people continue to list weights for weapons that don't seem to make any sense to me. So again, I'm not sure if FantasyCraft does is it a weight or is it encumbrance? Somebody could tell me. I would love it if it's just weight. A lot of these things make no sense, and the black powder weapons do make sense. And if it's encumbrance, it still doesn't make sense because the black powder weapons a lot less than the other things. So I'm confused. If someone could help me, I would really appreciate it. Other than that, they have one thing I do like in this. They have craftsmanship variances. So if a weapon is made by ogres or by pecks or by dwarves or elves, they'll have different characteristics. I think that's an excellent idea. I am fully in support of that idea. I wish more games would reflect that. I think it really does give it a nice flavor to it. Because in the real world, if you say, a sword is from X country, that brings up an idea of what that sword looks like and how it's going to behave in the hand. We don't have different sapient, humanoid races in this world, but we do have different cultures, and you can say, I'm using a sword from this culture, and so you have a very good idea what that sword is how that sword is going to look, how it's going to behave. So in a world that does have many different sapient humanoid races, saying, I've got a dwarven sword, you should be able to call up an image, and that image should have an attached creed or myth or history or stylistic design with it, so it makes perfect sense that it would have in game mechanic some different variances between an elven and a dwarven or a peck or an orc swords. Excellent idea. And then they have customizations, which you can add things in here, which makes some of the weapons can do bleed, some can be used as bayonets, I want to say a crossbow or on a rifle. I think that these are probably plug bayonets. I don't know if they're socket bayonets or not for rifles or firearms. Plug bayonets were useful, but they did disable the firearm's ability to work until you removed it, as opposed to ones that slide over the socket design that slides over the tip of the weapon, so you could fire it while it's still in place, but you couldn't really load it when it's still in place. Not easily, at least. So other than that, the rules, to my mind, just seem to have some design elements that I don't get, but that's not a shock. But overall, I think that they had some interesting stuff in here. They got some things right. They got some things, in my opinion, wrong. So I'm looking forward to people telling me about these weight / encumbrance rules. That would be nice. And I hope that people can give me some feedback on how they feel the game handled weapons and how successful they were. Or is it something that breaks immersion for you? Is it something that just pedantic weapons geeks like myself pay attention to? Everyone else just kind of brings out the magic hand wavium and doesn't worry about it. I'd like to hear your feedback.